Hey, everybody, welcome back to another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast. I'm your host, Omar Zaran. Thank you, as always, for joining me for another edition of the show. This week, some big news happened in the media rights world of sports, and I kind of want to talk about it a little bit because I have some thoughts. And what happened is that after months of negotiations now, ESPN and the NFL have reached a deal regarding the future of the NFL Network, NFL RedZone, and the various NFL media properties. I believe NFL Films is part of this as well. So basically, this is a deal that's going to be worth billions of dollars, and it leads to ESPN acquiring the rights to the NFL Network and its programming, but most importantly, probably the crown jewel of this deal is that ESPN now gets RedZone. So if you're not familiar, RedZone's that whip around show hosted by Scott Hansen, kind of flipping between every game on Sunday, so you kind of get an idea of everything that's going on. And in exchange, the NFL is getting some equity into ESPN, and that's the main thing I want to talk about is that equity piece and what that means. But before then, let's kind of talk about the significance of this deal and why it matters that ESPN has kind of done this and why the NFL has done this. So the NFL really has been looking to get out of the broadcasting business for a very long time. You know, they kind of did this as a little bit of an alternative to the other networks and never really took off the way it did. RedZone took off as a program, but everything else was kind of like there. It's kind of filler stuff that you would see at a bar, sports bar or something, right? So they've been looking to offload this media stuff for a while and not have to worry about individual programming and stuff, especially when you think like in the off season, like what are you going to play? A lot of times it's just reruns of old games from the previous season. So you get it to a media company like ESPN, they know what to do with it, and you don't got to worry about it anymore, and you just focus on running your league. For ESPN, the reason that they want to do this is because they are in the midst of launching their standalone streaming service. Just going to call it ESPN. Not confusing at all, right? That's going to be $30 a month. So you really have to want to have the programming that makes somebody want to spend $30 a month. Now, to be clear, this is a little bit different than that ESPN Plus package, which was add-on content that required a cable subscription before. So this is really aimed at the cord-cutting generation as more and more people move away from linear TV. Now, some people have YouTube TV like myself. I've been a YouTube TV user since its launch. And to me, as a sports watcher, I think that that's an incredibly valuable service because, you know, it gets you access to all the main NFL games, the NBA games, MLS, their sports package in their base plan, even before you add on other stuff, is pretty substantial. But when you think about ESPN has Monday Night Football, ESPN has NBA games, ESPN has a variety of soccer, ESPN has college football, especially in the SEC. $30 a month for Monday Night Football, SEC football, NBA games, it's compelling enough. And that's before you get to the unique programming, you know, your first takes, your get ups, you know, those type of shows that will also be a part of this ESPN streaming package. So for ESPN, they get RedZone now, which kind of solves the Sunday problem, right? Because they don't have any Sunday games because Fox and CBS have the 1 o'clock and 4 o'clock Eastern windows, and NBC has the night game. ESPN's kind of cut out of Sundays. They have Saturdays with college football with the SEC and MAC and a bunch of other conferences. And they have Monday with Monday Night Football, but they don't have Sunday. RedZone gives them Sunday, right? So if you are paying $30 and you don't have linear cable, you still want to catch games in the roundabout way, you could do that with RedZone now. I'm assuming they're going to keep Scott Hansen on board because he's kind of the face of that. It'd be kind of like if when Alex Trebek was hosting Jeopardy, if it changed networks and they wanted to replace Trebek, you don't do that because he's the face of the brand, right? So that's the reasoning there for ESPN. But what really struck me when I read this headline, and this was reported first by the Andrew Marchand of the Athletic, who kind of is always on top of this media rights stuff, is that the NFL gets equity in ESPN. And you may look, that might be a throwaway line to most people, but to me, that really matters. And when you look at both FS1 and ESPN, a bulk of their programming, I want to say, is NFL focused already. I would say probably like 80% or so is NFL focused, with NBA sprinkled in to account for most of the other 20%. Other sports, often don't get their fair share of coverage because the NFL is just suffocating, right? Because the NFL is a ratings leader. It's by far the most popular sport in this country. You could argue that this push towards RedZone and the NFL rights stuff is probably one of the reasons why the ESPN was so comfortable dropping baseball like they did to get out of their contract a couple of months earlier. So that is the landscape of ESPN, right? They're going to talk about NFL. Like the NBA playoffs were going on, and they were talking about the Dallas Cowboys, right? That's just how pervasive the NFL is in ESPN's programming. But the NFL is no angelic institute here, right? They make a lot of mistakes. Recently in the news, there was a man who played high school football who claimed he had CTE, who drove from Nevada all the way to New York City, allegedly with the intention of shooting the NFL offices for covering up CTE, right? And he ends up, murdering multiple people before he dies himself. And his brain scan did show that he did indeed have CTE. The NFL, it's well documented when it comes to CTE, has tried to brush it under the rug, tried to PR its way out of the problem. And when the concussion movie and book came out, a lot of that was under the microscope. And a lot of people had a tough time, I want to say about 8 to 10 years ago, had a tough time continuing to watch football because of the impact of head trauma and brain injuries. And now you had a case of somebody who didn't even make the league. He was just a high school football player, and he suffered from CTE from repeated blows to the head. And, the NFL, I would argue, hasn't done enough there, right? They added the Guardian helmet, but they didn't make it mandatory. And who knows how effective that is. But if there is a solution, you probably should make it mandatory, as opposed to giving players the option to continue going the old way. And then recently, I wrote about this on Medium, is that the NFL was kind of accused of collusion recently when it comes to paying players, paying quarterbacks guaranteed contracts in the fallout of the Deshaun Watson deal. The only people that have been reporting on this were Pablo Torre and Mike Florio. Both of these guys, it's important to know, have their own independent platforms. So Florio, who owns Pro Football Talk, they're affiliated with NBC, which, again, you could consider that maybe a conflict there because NBC has NFL rights. But Pablo, he just does it. He's independent media, right? And he was kind of leading the charge here, as Florio also reported on it as well. And so ESPN and FS1 weren't reporting on this, mainly, I would say, because they have existing strong relationships with the league. So now what you're doing by giving the NFL equity in ESPN is you're doubling down on that. So let's say there's a scandal in the NFL now. How is ESPN going to report that? Are they going to have journalistic integrity? Are they going to dig deep? And even though the NFL has a vested stake in their network, are they going to allow that to run? Or are they just going to, is it just going to be kind of NFL propaganda from the number one voice in sports? You could say whatever you want about ESPN these days, but the fact is that their voice, their reporting, they are still the source that people go to. People follow them on social media. People repost all of their content. People watch their shows. These are not nothing. The Pat McAfee show gets a ton of viewers. Stephen A. Smith gets a ton of views on his individual podcast and his stuff on ESPN through First Take. So they're still looked at as a knowledge base for general sports news in the United States in 2025. So when it becomes puff pieces only for the NFL, and then you consider ESPN also has like a documentary division, do we stop seeing documentaries about the NFL because might be too critical of the league? And I think we're kind of setting up a slippery slope here. And because this whole thing is kind of unique, because this is a league taking equity into a broadcaster. Now, a couple of times in history, it's been the other way around, where the broadcaster takes equity in the league. And that Unrivaled that happened at TNT got equity of that, and that one made sense for TNT because they're losing the NBA contract. They need to protect themselves, so they get onto this new league and they're hoping that it grows. Unrivaled had a really pretty successful first season, and they're hoping for more of that, especially now as they're losing the NBA contract after this year. And Fox, they took in equity in the United Football League, which was formerly the USFL and XFL, and they merged into one league. Fox has a pretty sizable chunk in the success of that league. That league's not doing too hot, so Fox might be not super jazzed about this investment, but they did it with the idea that as the media rights grow, they'll get first dibs. They'll be able to profit from it both ways, and in this kind of newer type of setup where linear TV isn't as important, isn't as popular as it once was, that makes sense. But now we have the league taking ownership pieces of the of the of the network that covers it, right? And to me, that's kind of problematic. And what it makes you think of is, for many of you who know me, you know that I love tech in addition to sports. And one of the podcasts I listen to is the Vergecast, and for the longest time, they're owned by Vox Media, who has investments from Comcast. So whenever they would make different types of criticisms of Comcast or NBC or something like that, they would have to comically put this disclaimer out that their opinions don't reflect the views of their parent company or whatever. And I just wonder, with how the NFL is structured and how it likes to control the discussion and conversation and talking points, it really is kind of honed into that in a major way. Are they going to let somebody get on TV and criticize the NFL for a rule change? Are they going to let somebody get on TV and say that a person who was suspended or fined shouldn't have been suspended or fined? Are they going to allow them to criticize referees, without any sense of circumstance? And that to me is the problem. And it highlights the big issue that we have now with the way that media is run. In the way the news is reported these days, there's always kind of a who's paying the money slant. And we see that with like the New York Times, where they're going to report something a certain way because of who donated money to them, who has funded and bankrolled things in the background. It's why independent outlets are so much more important these days, because you can at least, if they don't have all the same access, you can at least take solace in the fact that at least they're not paid off, right? And that's kind of the rub there, where you want to have, good faith journalism, good faith reporting. And I think as the NFL continues to get more in bed with ESPN, and I wouldn't be surprised if they did the same with Fox Sports eventually as well, where they're going to control the conversation. And the NFL, historically, as a league, has a very rich history of trying to control the conversation. They want to dominate the conversation. They will create enemies of people just because they kind of went another way. They are a ruthless business that's often controlled by lawyers, right? It's why the commissioner of the league is usually has a legal background. Goodell has a legal background. So that is my fear. And as NFL, there's a race now for the NFL rights once they get renewed in a few years here about who's going to get in on this. Now, you can imagine Netflix will still be in there. You can imagine that Amazon will try to expand its reach beyond Thursday night with Prime Video. But ESPN, with the streaming service, is going to 100% use Disney's money to try and get more games out. And it presents an interesting spot for both Fox and CBS. Now, CBS will probably lean on its Paramount Plus offering for their packages, but streaming is going to be a big part of it. We saw it with the NBA negotiations. Peacock, Amazon Prime, these were all, Netflix, were all big parts, big pieces of this negotiation tactic, right? And so the streaming aspect has to be considered. So if the league, though, is going to continue to try and get pieces of equity here and there to kind of boost its bottom line and to protect itself in further media rights negotiations, then when are we going to get kind of reporting that we don't have to think twice about? Is it going to be a thing where it's kind of like the podcast space now, where a lot of these player-run podcasts have become a little bit less critical, right? Where they have their own agendas to maintain, right? And if the league is kind of funneling money into a major media partner, you're really kind of looking at you're going to be looking at everything through NFL tinted glasses, right? There aren't going to be any critical analyses of the league and how it's operating and all that. And it, to me, further indicates the demise of good reporting that we're seeing in the sports space now, where everybody is so hungry for access. They want to get the scoop, right? Like you look at the insiders in both the NBA and the NFL, Adam Schefter, Ian Rappaport, Shams Charania, Chris Haynes. These guys will never try to ruffle any feathers, right? They're just trying to report, and they're trying to maintain the access and the relationships as much as they can because they want to continue having that access as an access-based industry. And when the league has a vested interest in your company and you want to maintain them being on your good side, you're probably not going to report things that are negative about the league. Again, guys being rushed back from injury, how the league is handling head injuries, how the league is implementing new technologies. Do these new technologies work? What is their relationship like with college? All this different stuff. Why are they kowtowing to a political figure? Whatever the case may be that you might have a critique of a league about, now by having an equity, we're entering a realm where there is a possibility that those type of critiques can't be levied. So then what do you do? And I often feel like as ESPN and others are kind of leaning more into people recognize athletes, get athletes on the network, and you're getting rid of journalists in the process. ESPN did it by getting rid of Around the Horn, which is a very journalist-centric type of show. And now they're going to move into a different direction to make it more like a Pat McAfee model, where having a former player on, and it's just kind of like lifestyles of the rich and famous in a way, because you're just relying on people who played the game more than people who can analyze it at a high level. And the way I kind of look at it is ESPN recently parted ways with Shannon Sharp, and Sharp, obviously with all the troubling accusations, kind of just taking that out of the consideration for a second, he was a big time entertainer, right? Like his appeal was the entertainment factor, not so much the on the field football analysis. And you look at somebody like Mina Kimes, who never played it down in the NFL, obviously, but she's one of the best analysts in the game. I wonder, with this move, do the Mina Kimeses of the world, the hard-hitting journalists of the world, are they phased out because they want a more recognizable player voice that's going to be there, right? Do they bring in a Steve Smith Jr. instead because people recognize him for when he played for the Panthers or whatever, right? And that is interesting to me. We see it already in the NBA, where a lot of these guys have kind of gone different routes. Zach Lowe gets let go by ESPN. He lands at the Ringer. We see somebody like Mark Stein went his independent route with he worked for the New York Times for years and Yahoo and all these other outlets, and now he has his own Substack that he breaks news on. And I wonder if that's the lane where reporters kind of have their own thing. And one of the few places where it's still like that, I think, is The Athletic. Yahoo Sports does it a little bit too, but I do find myself worrying about good writing, good reporting, solid analysis, right? Is that kind of becoming a thing of the past as we kind of lean more into this whole bro culture and access to players, so let's be boys with all of them, that kind of thing? And I think we need to have a continued space where people can criticize a league, can criticize an athlete, not to the point of slander, but to the point of saying, hey, this is where it went wrong. Here's a potential alternative solution. And I think that that's just wildly, wildly important in today's landscape. And I fear that with this ESPN move, we're going to see more like it. Is the NBA in a future negotiation about NBA TV going to require that whoever they sell those rights to, that the NBA gets equity there, so that it's spoken about in a favorable manner? Do we get that in baseball? Do we get that, in other sports as well? And it's something that I'm concerned about. And we're kind of seeing it already with like the way the Apple TV MLS negotiation went. Nobody really pays as much attention to the MLS, but Messi getting kind of Apple TV revenues, like this continued mingling. I just wonder if the conversation and the way we look at about sports and the storytelling will suffer as a result. I hope it doesn't, but it seems like we might be heading down that path. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in to another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast. I appreciate you checking us out as always. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider subscribing on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify. If you'd like to catch some of my written pieces, they are on Medium, omarzaran.medium.com. Thank you, as always, for tuning in for another edition of Deep Cover Podcast, and I will see you all next time.